Hi everyone, I'm Evan Mitchell, Music Director of the Kingston Symphony Orchestra, and we are back for another Symphony Sunday. This time it's featuring Kristan Toczko, who is a wonderful harpist, and our most recent concerto soloist. Kristan, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, no problem.
So Kristan, you're actually the very first concerto soloist to join us on Symphony Sundays, and I think that gives us the opportunity to chat about some interesting topics. Particularly with regards to concertos, when we think about concertos, we often think about the ones that come to mind. The quickest for most people, I would say, would be the concertos for, let's say, the usual solo instruments, the violin, the cello, the piano. There are a bunch of great harp concertos out there, and I am delighted to be acquainted with quite a few of them because of my own past experience with a couple of harp galas. But it seems to be that harp concertos, because they're not in the mainstream, we see them relatively rarely. Harp, we often hear featured prominently in the orchestral context, but I'm wondering if it feels unusual for you, as someone who plays an awful lot of orchestral harp, to be a harp soloist in front of the orchestra.
Right. Well, yeah, the harp is actually a fairly new instrument compared to all the other instruments in the orchestra, so we just don't have as much repertoire that's been written for us, which I think is part of the reason why we don't see many harp concertos being performed. So yeah, I'd say it does feel a bit surreal when I'm up at the front in the center of the action of the orchestra, like all eyes on me. As usually in an orchestra, harpists are found at the very back. So it's really nice to just be able to play out, have the freedom to like show off a little bit, and just be a bit more musical.
Great. Well, the piece that you played for us is a really wonderful concerto for harp, written by Michael Conway Baker, a Canadian composer. And the Conway Baker Concerto is a piece that you learned when you were very young, and you performed it for the very first time with the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. This is coming on 10 years ago, and that was actually the reason why I wanted to program it for this particular concert, was because that was when we met each other, I believe, for the very first time, working on this piece for the World Harp Congress back in 2010. My goodness. Now, I know this is a piece that is pretty close to you. I'm wondering if you can tell me how your impression of this piece has changed since you first learned it a decade ago, and how you may be approaching it differently now, or how you may be approaching it the same.
Sure. Yeah, so when I played that concerto in Vancouver, I was given roughly 6 weeks to learn and memorize that piece. It was also my first time I was performing a concerto with an orchestra, and to top it all off, I had to perform for an audience entirely consisting of harpists. So yeah I guess I was kind of thrown into the deep end there. But yeah, I'd say my impression of the piece has definitely grown since I first perform it. I mean, this always happens, like when you bring, at least for myself, when I'm bringing a piece back in my fingers again, it always gives me the opportunity to work on it from a new perspective, just to like explore different phrasing ideas, colors, and hopefully bring something different to the table. So yeah, I really have fun. I like to have fun with the exploration process, just to see how I can convey the music uniquely and in the best way that I can.
Well, that's really the mark of a good piece of music, is that there is the depth that you can find those moments. You can find a way to totally have a completely different perspective on it. Not only as you grow as a musician, but let's say that you're performing this concerto all the time, and then from one week to the next, what do you do? How do you find the way to be able to present it differently so it feels fresh and exciting? And I do think that this piece, it's really wonderful. We're going to be playing the first 2 minutes of the first movement of this concerto. It's really lovely, a wonderful feature for the harp, I think, and a really delightful piece. And it doesn't surprise me that you would consider it to have just that kind of depth. I remember hearing about a story about Toscanini, who was feverishly studying his score of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in the minutes leading up to one of his NBC radio broadcasts, and I guess the person who was grabbing it said, "Well, Maestro, don't you feel as though you know this piece well enough?" And he said, "Well, I'm actually convinced that I might have missed something." He was always looking for something new, and apparently every time he looked at the score, he found something new, and that's the mark of really great music. Now, in that vein, from an experiential perspective, you have a lot of experience as an orchestral harpist. Yeah, you, of course, that's one of the ways in which you perform on your instrument. You've done a lot of solo work. I know you've done chamber music as well. With specific regards to the orchestra, it's not as though the harp is subordinate in the orchestral texture. Of quite the opposite. I mean, all the time we're always concerned about making sure that we can hear the harp cutting through and making sure that it's not getting overpowered by the other instruments. So you're often playing something that's exposed in the orchestral context, meant to cut through. But that's a very different scenario than being out front.
Sure.
And really being in charge of making the music as opposed to being subordinate to a conductor or playing within an ensemble. Being out front and then having to be the leader, in which literally you are the one who's saying, this is the tempo, this is where we're going, this is the direction, this is how I'm handling this particular passage. That seems to be very different for the concerto context, more so than with the orchestral context. And I feel like that's different for the harp than say, again, if you have violinists in the orchestra, they'll feel comfortable on sort of both sides of that fence, as it were. But with harp, it's a little different. But does that context seem different for you as a harpist from being within the orchestra as opposed to being in front of it, or is that the case, or am I totally out to lunch here?
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely a lot more of the instrument in harp concertos. They really do show off the instrument more. So often in the orchestral setting, we're sitting counting rests for long periods of time before,
Sure.
our show-stopping glissando or that one beautiful beautiful rolled chord. But in a concerto context, we play more constantly. So now, speaking about the role of a harp soloist, sometimes we actually take the orchestra's role and our part becomes the accompaniment part. So we try to keep our sound just slightly over top of the orchestra, but we really try to not take too much away from what's going on musically in the orchestra, as they would have the melody at that point. So personally, I really like how the stage can be shared like this. So then it really becomes more of like a chamber music collaboration rather than just the soloist being kind of separate from the orchestra.
And us being dragged along, kicking and screaming, as it were.
Yeah.
Or very willingly, in our case, of course. Yeah.
It's all fun.
So one thing I want to ask you,
Sure.
this is actually something I've thought of just right now. A lot of harpists that I know have particular fondness for the harp writing of Ravel. And and some people will curse Ravel's name for the difficulty of the harp writing, but at the same time they'll say it's some of the best music that they've ever heard for written for the harp. I'm just curious, because Ravel was such an important figure for harp writing in this context. What are your thoughts on Ravel? How do you feel about Maurice Ravel and his harp writing?
Yeah, I love Ravel's music. It's just all the classics in orchestra. They're like all my favorite. Generally, I think this applies to all good harp music. If it fits well in the fingers, if it makes good use of the register and the tone for those registers, and just makes good use of pedal work as well. Ravel, there's so many beautiful, lush glissandos, and he makes really good use of enharmonics, and it's just like an explosion of color that he's somehow able to like put on the paper like that. So yeah, anything Ravel, love it. All harpists love it. Just works really well for us in our fingers.
Well, that's great. The thing, harp is very difficult to write for as a composer. It's actually something, a characteristic that is shared with the marimba. The marimba is a very difficult instrument to write for because of the nature of the technique of the instrument. It's really quite different than, it's not to say that all winds have a similar technique. They obviously don't. Right. But the mechanics are at least physically understandable. Whereas the nature of playing the harp is a very singular thing. The nature of playing the marimba is a very singular thing. And and I think that writing well for the instrument, making it so that it just makes sense physically, that is a great way to be able to open the gate, to lead the player down the path of the best possible opportunity for good music making. So that's really great to know. So now we're gonna have a listen to the first 2 minutes of your performance with the Kingston Symphony Orchestra of Michael Conway Baker's Harp Concerto, the first movement. Thank you so much for joining me, Kristan. It's been a pleasure.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for having me. This has been fun.